Welcome to the Battles We Pick podcast, where advocates and organizers talk about their work pushing for social, political, and policy change. Today's guest, Charles Kamasaki, has had a distinguished career as an advocate for immigration reform and is an eminent leader and voice in that community. For several decades, Kamasaki has guided the work of Unidos US, formerly known as the National Council of La Raza, the nation's largest Hispanic civil rights and advocacy organization. He is also author of Immigration Reform, The Corpse That Will Not Die, an authoritative account of the last successful effort at comprehensive reform legislation in the 1980s, a legislative push in which he was a key player. Our conversation was a great chance to explore the challenges of an especially tough issue, one that's been demagogued and exploited by the MAGA movement and is a hot button in the current election. Charles and I traced the issue's political roots back to basic questions of what it means to be an American. He also helped draw lessons from that previous round of comprehensive reforms. And we delved into comparisons with healthcare reform and Obamacare, leading broader insights about advocacy work. We had a fascinating discussion of the need for narratives both from the perspective of people directly affected by deportation, as well as the impact on their kids, colleagues, customers, and neighbors. Charles explained why advocates need to connect and communicate more with immigration opponents and skeptics, even if those political segments have veered way off the mainstream. Be sure to catch our concluding discussion of why it's impractical to build a set of reforms that all like-minded allies would support. I know you'll get a lot out of this episode. I know I sure did. Today's guest has been a decades-long advocate on one of the most, if not the most, vexed of all legislative subjects, immigration reform. So this will be a great chance to unpack really tough advocacy challenges and how they're viewed and dealt with. On top of his years of experience as an advocate for Unidos US, Charles Kamasaki is the author of Immigration Reform, The Corpse That Will Not Die. I'm going to give you a compliment on the book that I learned from a Hall of Fame level advocate I was fortunate to know, Alison Desforges. Your book is a document. It's a word she reserved for authoritative records of events. So thanks for the book and for being with us today.
Well, thank you, David, and thanks for the compliment. I guess what I would say is it's an epic story. And I just hope I did justice to what it took to enact the last comprehensive immigration reform we've enacted.
On that exact note, so it is often noted that comprehensive immigration reform hasn't been enacted in nearly 40 years. So you were both a participant in shaping that long ago legislation as an advocate, as well as we've just been saying, a chronicler of that story. So I'd like to start with the overall nature of the problem. Immigration reform seems almost uniquely difficult to accomplish. Why is that?
Well, I guess I would start with a little tiny bit of pushback. I believe any massive, complex reform is difficult. And maybe more difficult now, but these things weren't easy in the past either. And just to give you one example, when I first came to Washington in 1982, I had the opportunity to work with Senator Kennedy's office on a number of issues, including immigration. And in chatting with his staff, they would talk about how close they came to healthcare reform in the 70s, and how they lamented that they just couldn't get it done. And maybe the 80s would be the time it would happen. Well, we know it didn't happen. And then we know that President Clinton had it as his signature issue when he was elected in 1992, and it died, actually died multiple times. And then it wasn't until President Obama made it his signature issue in 2009 that it passed in 2010. But I would also note that it the Affordable Care Act, as we know it, would not exist but for John McCain literally rising from his deathbed to oppose elimination of the Affordable Care Act, a bill that he opposed the first time around. And to some extent, I think he was kind of sticking it in President Trump's eye at the time. So just to say, big bills of any kind are really challenging, not just to enact, but to preserve. But to your question, I think there are aspects of immigration that are unique. I think the ones we're familiar with are, it's a really polarized time. And immigration, for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is a controversial president like President Trump making it his signature issue, it's become more partisan, what some would call hyper-partisan. And in a closely divided Congress and closely divided country, it's going to be hard to enact issues that are clearly identified as heavily partisan. I think the issue that maybe doesn't get as much attention, or at least as much in-depth attention as it deserves, is immigration by its very definition strikes right at the heart of American identity, who we are as a country, right? And at some level, this is maybe unfair, but to those who believe our country is really, founded on Judeo-Christian ideals, and really the people of America are all united by virtue of just being in the country and coming from a certain kind of heritage. The shorthand way might be blood and soil. Immigration is highly threatening. On the other hand, even people who believe that America is really about ideals, equality, opportunity, and so forth, there are aspects of immigration that are also threatening to some basic ideals. So if you believe that we are founded as a nation on the rule of law, how do you reconcile the existence of 10, 11, 12 million people who came into the country without authorization? Is kind of a fundamental question. And so I think both because of the identity questions around really race, but also the questions around this is an issue that, as one observer wrote back in the 80s, actually, it pits right against right. It is not solely advancing a particular value.
What are your keys to unlocking that? Is there a way that identity debate needs to be joined and changed?
Well, political scientist John Kingdon, really one of the great political scientists of our time, used to have this 3 Ps formula. You need a well-recognized problem stream, a wide consensus around a policy stream to respond to it, and then you needed political will. I actually think those conditions, those preconditions, I guess, as it were, have existed with immigration reform for some time. The issue has been, I think, Professor Kingdon left out a couple of P's from that formula. One of those is you have to have the right people, not just in the legislative branch, but as advocates in the executive branch, in the pundit class. And, there are all sorts of aspects that affect the shaping of policy. Now, David, I'll note that many of these barriers or similar kinds of barriers existed back in the 1980s when the Immigration Reform and Control Act was enacted. And I'm happy to go further into how the legislators and advocates kind of overcame some of those challenges. But but maybe talking less about the history and more about the current situation. I think for advocates today, first of all, we have to have a clear understanding of how big the challenge is and what the challenges are. And you know this from your extensive advocacy history, it's always harder to pass something than to stop something. Um, you know, Machiavelli, maybe the first political scientist of modern times, made a big point of noting that defenders of the status quo are always in a stronger position than those trying to change it. Um, and I think the other thing that's really an issue is with trying to promote something or advance something or pass something that's new. I hate to use sports analogies, but I used to have an old football coach that said, if you're on offense and you're trying to move the ball down the field, all 11 people have to do their jobs. If one person misses a block, then your quarterback's going to get sacked or your runner's going to get, hit in the backfield, and you just can't move forward. Whereas if you're on defense, one great play can totally mess up what the offense is trying to do. So, I think it's important to understand the scope and the nature of the challenge when you're going into it.
We are of a similar age. I don't recall a similar sense of panic stoked. Would you argue that that the issue was as politically fraught the last time success was achieved?
I think so. So let's go back to the 1980s, and let me see if I can set the scene a little bit. So illegal immigration, as it was then known, from Mexico principally, but south of the border generally, because that was also the beginning of the decades-long Central American migration to the U.S., had hit record highs. And so not terribly dissimilar from the current situation, or recent situation, I should say. And that was the result of this combination, perfect storm, if you will, to use a trite phrase, of several factors. So one was that the 1965 Immigration Act, which many people are familiar with, that was the bill that President Johnson signed. It was an original Kennedy bill that eliminated so-called national origins quotas that were widely recognized as racist, and really precipitated a great expansion as well as increased diversity in our legal immigration stream. Had passed in 1965, but a little known aspect of it was, for complicated reasons, it had actually cut legal immigration from Mexico and the Western Hemisphere in half. So there were fewer ways to enter legally. The second thing that happened was that we ended the so-called Bracero program in the 1960s. This was a temporary worker program that at its height allowed some 800,000 mainly Mexicans to enter the United States, mainly to work in agriculture. So 800,000 people a year. And this was, interestingly enough, enacted as a World War II emergency measure when, we had our people out in fighting in World War II as well as in the factories, and we needed bodies to harvest crops.
So this is the agricultural equivalent of Rosie the Riveter.
Indeed. But interestingly enough, it didn't end when World War II ended. And in part, it didn't end because of the power of Western growers who had, and agriculture generally, who had come to depend on these immigrant workers, first as part of this so-called Bracero program, but then later as undocumented workers. So they had no interest. So on the one hand, the supply, the ability to enter legally, had shut off due to cutting legal immigration from the Western Hemisphere in half, and the fact that we had ended the Bracero program, and for good reason. It was a program rife with exploitation of workers. And then the final factor was, well, there's maybe a fourth factor, but the third major factor was this coincided with the peak of the Mexican fertility rate, and a Mexican economy that was unable to create enough jobs for the numbers of people entering the workforce. So this combination of massive demand and decreased supply meant that pressure on our southern border was substantially increased. The other thing that was obvious was that the 60s and at least much of the 70s, the United States experienced a truly massive economic expansion that is historic in many respects. So again, lots of demand, little supply, lots of people began to enter unlawfully. So this was an issue that many people believed at the time just could not be solved. Many attempts had been made, notably by Representative Peter Rodino, who had tried to pass legislation in the 70s. In fact, legislation passed the House twice, only to die in the Senate to cut down on unlawful entries. And so they finally punted to a commission that was created in the late 1970s called the Select Commission on Immigration and Refugee Policy. Out of that commission, and this was a time when government commissions were really revered and respected, and this particular commission was headed by, and included some of the most respected personages in modern America. It reported out a proposal for a bill, and these two relatively obscure legislators, one was a guy named Al Simpson, newly elected senator from Wyoming. The other was a Republican, conservative Republican at that. And the other was a guy named Romano, nicknamed Ron Mazzoli, who tragically recently passed away. A moderate Democrat from Kentucky, actually from the same district that Mitch McConnell was then the county commissioner of, got together and decided to try and enact legislation. Now, as I noted, they were trying to enact, they were the ones who were trying to change the law. They were the reformers, and their bill proposed crackdowns on unlawful migration, something on temporary workers, really what ultimately would have been a cutback in legal immigration, restrictions on asylum. Some of this stuff should start to sound familiar, and a legalization program to try and deal with parts of the unauthorized population. That bill was introduced in 1981. It passed the Select Commission issued its report in 1981. A bill passed the Senate in 1982, died in the House. Passed in the Senate again in 1983, died in conference committee in 1984 after it did pass the House, and finally wasn't enacted until 1986. And notably, it, as enacted, included not just enforcement, but a much more generous legalization program. And instead of a temporary worker program, it included a legalization program for farm workers, as opposed to just a temporary worker program. And finally, I would just note it largely punted on the questions of asylum and reducing legal immigration for a subsequent bill, which was ultimately enacted in 1990. And I'm happy to talk further about that. So this was a long process, arguably took over 15 years from the time that Representative Rodino's first bill passed in the 1970s to when it was finally enacted in 1986, and really not fully completed until 1990. And as I say, it died multiple times before it was enacted.
Let's see if I can connect the dot to healthcare reform. The key to unlocking the Affordable Care Act was America's insurers. Karen Ignati, is that right? I think so. And a decision by a major economic actor to take a new stance. For them, it was this grand bargain that they would loosen up pre-existing conditions, and get rid of lifetime caps and all that, and in exchange, get a much larger customer base. Would you say that the thing that would be most likely to help really get the ball rolling would be, that sort of commitment from a major economic player? Is that a lesson? Because it sounded like with the growers that was part of the immigration reform story as well.
I think it's part of the story, and I don't disagree with your characterization of healthcare reform. I also think the complementary piece of that was the Obama administration's decision to go with a package that largely preserved the existing insurance system. Right? You might, people who are, even younger than us will recall that there was a debate, should it be Medicare for all? Well, if it's not Medicare for all, should there be a public option? Which the insurers argued would eventually eliminate private insurance, correctly or not. I happen to think that was not correct. But in any event, there were strategic decisions and compromises, not just by private industry actors, but by the administration and lawmakers and advocates as well. So I think that spirit of trying to get to yes and overcoming challenges is common to both. And I just would remind folks, there was almost uniform Republican opposition to the Affordable Care Act. Even then Governor Mitt Romney, who had enacted something very similar and was proud of it at the time in Massachusetts as a presidential candidate, denied it. It was because that part of his record didn't exist.
Right. The blueprint for Obamacare famously was a Heritage Foundation proposal.
Indeed. And so, again, pro-immigration advocates frequently point to, oh my God, Congressman X or Senator Y, Lindsey Graham is a good example, who was a original sponsor of the DREAM Act. Once Trump came into office, he totally changed his position. And, it's just an example of why these issues just can't be resolved if you can't count on people not to flip-flop according to prevailing political winds. I look at it somewhat differently. As politicians are going to flip-flop based on prevailing political winds, and it's the job of advocates to try and craft the combination of the right policies, the right media narratives, and the right politics to try and break through the noise and the legislative gridlock. So,
before I do, you just mentioned narrative, and does seem to be a particularly, a vexed piece of this vexed challenge. And here we are, we're having this conversation at a moment when Republican campaigns are calling for mass deportations, enormous scale. And, that might be a good angle on the narrative dynamics because, what seems to sound seductive a little bit to some parts of the electorate, once anybody with a heart looks at the impact, Grandpa who owns the corner store has gotten kicked out, and the kids are U.S. citizens. Other parents from the kids' school all of a sudden are gone. It's horrific. But that's just one part. So I'd love to hear, kind of your view on the narrative, where we are and where we need to get to.
Well, I think it's only honest to note that I think opponents of reform, immigration opponents generally, have the better of the argument right now. And I think there's at least one reason we don't talk about very much as pro-immigration advocates is that there is a fundamental truth to their concerns about demographic change. If you were to ask, even the centrist or even kind of nativist anti-immigrant groups, whether they think they're winning or losing, they would say they're losing. And they would say that the foreign-born population was 6 or 7% in the 1980s when the Immigration Reform and Control Act passed. It's probably now 15%. And because our population has grown so much, it's gone from maybe 20 million in the 1980s to 50 million now. That's mainly been a product of legal immigration, not unauthorized migration. It's mainly a product of legal immigration. And I think there are a couple of things to note about that. I mean, one, so if you're concerned about immigration changing the character of the country, there's a basis for that concern. It's not all hype.
So is that an argument for a more direct and explicit debate about the nature of being American and that classic? Are we? I mean, we don't have citizenship based on blood ties and lineages. Some other countries do. Well, there's always been this idea that this is a country of an idea and ideals and principles, and not, an ethnicity. Are you basically saying we need to talk about that?
I do. I think we need to talk to different audiences, and I think we need to talk about the issues differently. So you raised the issue of mass deportation, and I think that's a great example. So as the electorate and as the body politic and as legislators themselves have become more hyper-partisan, as it were, so have advocates. And so the result, in part, is that it's hard to find pro-immigration advocates who talk to a lot of Republican offices. In fact, it's really quite rare. And I would contrast that back to the 80s, 90s, even the 2000s, when, it was kind of a point of pride of the pro-immigrant coalitions that we would visit every Senate office. And, even if people aren't with us, we wanted to hear them out and we wanted to make the case for what we were trying to do, which is related to a second point I would make is, I think we take too much for granted. We don't engage in case making, whether it's on the broader question of American identity or the question of the economic value of immigration, often enough. And we certainly don't make it often enough in Republican circles. So, just to give you an example, the National Academy of Sciences will issue a report, or the Congressional Budget Office, on the value of immigration, which they actually just did last week. Trillions of dollars of benefits to GNP and or GDP, and massive increases in tax revenues and benefits to employment. And then, a couple of us will write an op-ed for the New York Times or the Washington Post. Paul Krugman will carry it on his, will write a favorable op-ed, all of which has happened, famously economic contributor for the New York Times. People will get on MSNBC and talk about it, maybe CNN if they're lucky. And then it's kind of like, we're done.
But if we're invoking senators from back in the day, Lowell Weicker famously said, "I didn't leave the party left me." Is the reason that the connections have gotten broken between advocates and Republicans is that the advocates are the Republicans who seem to have gone off in a rather radical direction.
I don't disagree with that. And it may be unfair, which I think a lot of advocates will believe and think and feel. And they'll say it's not fair to try and create some sort of moral equivalence between the two parties. I approach these issues much more pragmatically. We need 60
votes. It's still
votes.
A two-party system.
We need 60 votes in the Senate. We need somebody who's going to schedule a bill and pass it in the House, where we've had the votes multiple times, where speakers have refused to put bills on the floor. And we need a president who's going to sign it. Those are just hard facts of our system. And we can say how unfair it is and propose all sorts of legislative procedural reforms or whatever. It just doesn't matter. Those are hard facts. So again, I would say we need to talk to those offices. I think we need to go on Fox News and make the case. There's kind of an unspoken, assumption we're just not going to, deign to go onto that, network. I think we need to go on right-wing talk shows. I think we need to do the drudgery of the C-SPAN open mic, which can be very painful for advocates. And, you get all sorts of questions out of left field. But I think every little bit helps. But perhaps most importantly, I think we need to change the locus of our strategic communications. So over the last several decades, you've had this movement, not with which I disagree greatly, and it's totally understandable, of having more immigrants speak for themselves and tell their own stories. And the argument has been, right, from a representational equity standpoint, if these are issues that are going to disproportionately affect people of color, then we should have people of color as spokespeople. I don't oppose that. But in telling immigrant stories, I think we often appear, and I think it's actually, in fact, we do ignore American national interests. So take your issue of mass deportation. Most of what you've seen in the press, particularly in the mainstream press or the progressive press or progressive outlets, is how devastating this would be to immigrants, how harmful it would be to them and their communities. And all of that is true. But I happen to think probably our strongest argument is, what about the American citizen children the American citizen spouses, the American citizen friends, relatives, and what would happen with their lives. That would we force, in effect, deport children just because they happen to have undocumented parents? Or would we assume responsibility for them as wards of the state by deporting their parents? You know, that's, I think, putting American interests front and center is not something we do very often, and it's often kind of a byproduct or a you know a story that's way down in our arguments. And I think it should be our lead that immigration is good for the country. It's always been good for the country. It's inextricably tied to the country, and the reason is it benefits American citizens and American interests.
No, I can see that. That makes a lot of sense. So, at any given moment, once the ball does get rolling, right, and there start to be proposals under serious consideration, even draft bills and language, a dynamic kicks in where, as you say, keeping all 11 players doing their job, and some cross pressures of who wants what and how badly, start to put stress on the coalition.
So I would say, like any diverse set of interests, there are probably some differences, even within the principal Dream Act advocates. And some would say, hey, it's our best shot, let's take it. And others would say, well, what about the parents? And, even with, say, the massive influx of potential asylum seekers today, some people would say, well, our first interest ought to be to uphold and respect the human rights of those potential asylum seekers. And others would say, well, what about the long-term undocumented? So yes, there are going to be stresses and strains within the broad pro-immigrant coalition, as it were. I have maybe a slightly different take. I mean, it's a very common mantra that we'll hear, that we all have to be on the same page, or we all have to be singing from the common hymnal. And I'm not actually in agreement with that. And let me outline why. The first thing is true is that I think increasingly among these broad coalitions, everybody has a veto. And what that means is that anything that's different or innovative or upsets the existing order or is going to hurt somebody's feelings or, God forbid, could actually hurt Democrats' political prospects in some cases, is automatically ruled off the table.
Quaker meeting rules are kind of a hard way to write legislation, to put it mildly.
Well, and, these broader notions, again, I respect all of these perspectives, but, everything is intersectional. So we have to consult with the LGBT community, and we have to consult with the climate change community. We have to consult with the, people fighting economic inequality, and kind of everybody has to agree. I think increasingly is a recipe for we just can't propose anything new. And it all goes down to the kind of lowest common denominator. And so we get what often happens is seemingly unanimity among just Democrats that actually masks quite significant differences. I personally would rather have, a little bit more freewheeling coalitions. Let people try unusual things. Don't automatically coalesce around and to oppose any new idea. And I think of policymaking as more of a market. Kind of throw out some ideas, and some people are going to buy some, and some people are going to buy others, and it ultimately doesn't really matter whether product A is better engineered than product B. If more people buy product B, that's what's going to succeed in the market. And so I would really rather have, in some ways, what I described in my book is, we had people going off the reservation all the time, and trying this and trying that, and we would have these brutal fights in our meetings, and people kicking people out of the coalition, and then they'd come back in, and people leaving the coalition, and I think, as uncomfortable as that is sometimes, I actually think it's necessary, to at least, if people are going to go a different way, at least respect that. And I think it's more that kind of market type force that ultimately results in the kinds of compromises that often are needed to enact legislation.
Well, you've just laid out very clear. We use the phrase "what the market will bear" in this kind of political and policy context, and that's a really great explanation of exactly what that means. Well, as we saw, I arrived at this conversation believing in the near impossibility of reviving the prospects and actually getting something done, and appreciate that you've made a really persuasive case for what might be possible and how. And so thanks so much for laying that out for us.
I'm known historically within my organization as kind of a curmudgeon or a contrarian, and maybe that's that side of me coming out. But I also think, if the fundamentals are in place, then you got to keep trying. And the vast majority of the American people think that our immigration system or systems is broken, and that changes are needed. And I think too often advocates on the pro-reform side or the pro-immigration side want everything, and folks on the other side want nothing. And bills have passed the Senate twice in the last couple of decades, and that's no small feat. And under Nancy Pelosi, some somewhat more partisan bills passed the House a couple of times, and so I don't think we're as far away as some people think.
Well, you've got to keep trying are definitely words for any advocate to live by. Thank you so much, Charles.
Thank you, David. Really appreciated this opportunity.